London is a city of ceremony, of polished brass and pressed lapels, of invitations printed on cardstock thick enough to withstand a light drizzle, and of dinners at which the food is largely incidental to the business being conducted beneath the table. Ceremony is the city's great lubricant. It keeps the machinery turning, the right hands shaking, the wrong questions unasked.
But ceremony, like power, is rarely what it appears. Tonight, a pair of white gloves arrives at a private inquirer's office without explanation or sender. Before the day is out, a man lies dead in Eaton Place. 11 lives hang by a silk thread, and Miss Maud West finds herself at the centre of a conspiracy that reaches from the docks of Limehouse to the drawing rooms of the Austrian embassy.
MicroPulse Radio Mystery Theatre presents The Diplomat's Gloves. And now, Act 1, The Delivery.
My home on Claremont Square occupies the first floor and above of a Georgian townhouse that has, over the years, arranged itself entirely around the requirements of my work. The drawing room faces the street and receives clients. The office, properly speaking, lies behind it, connected by a door I keep closed when I wish to think, and open when I wish to be found. It is a practical arrangement, and London has always understood practical arrangements, provided they are conducted with sufficient composure. The office itself is not large, but it is mine, and I have furnished it to suit the work rather than the impression. A desk that bears the marks of several years of earnest use. 2 chairs for clients, one comfortable, one slightly less so, which tells me a great deal about a person depending on which they choose. A filing cabinet with a lock that I change every 6 months, and a second drawer that I do not mention to anyone. The window looks out over the street below, which is endlessly instructive. London performs itself continuously, for anyone with the patience to watch. I have received many curious things at this office. Unsigned confessions, some of them almost certainly genuine. Jars of evidence best left unopened. And on one occasion, a Tuesday in March, as I recall, a live canary arrived in a small cage with a note tied to its leg that read simply, "Ask the bird." The bird, when consulted, said nothing of use, though it did develop an apparent fondness for my filing cabinet, and had to be rehomed with my neighbour Mrs. Hartley, who named it Gerald and considers it excellent company. But on a cold Thursday morning in November, what arrived was a box, white, unmarked, tied with a black ribbon of the sort one associates with mourning, or with a gift from someone who wishes to be taken seriously. My clerk, a young man of admirable efficiency and very few questions, placed it on the desk without comment and returned to his post. I sat with the box for a full minute before I touched it, which is not timidity, it is method. A great deal can be learned from a thing before you open it, if you are willing to look. The box was of good quality card, not the sort used by department stores, but the kind employed by specialist houses, milliners, jewellers, the better sort of glover. The ribbon had been tied by someone who knew what they were doing. The bow was symmetrical and snug, not decorative, but functional. Whoever sent this was precise by nature, not by effort. There was no postmark. It had been delivered by hand. Inside, folded with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed, lay a single white evening glove. A lady's glove. Finest kid leather, supple and immaculate, the kind that does not come cheaply and is not bought carelessly. The sort one wears to embassy dinners, where the real business is conducted somewhere between the salmon course and the sorbet, in murmured asides and significant glances, and nobody mentions it afterwards over port. There was no note, no card, no sender, no explanation whatsoever. I held the glove up to the light from the window. The stitching was extraordinary, close, even, entirely hand-done. Along the inner seam, barely visible unless you were looking, the thread changed slightly in texture. Not a flaw, a deliberate variation. Something had been sewn into this glove. Something that required the concealment to be perfect. Right then. Someone sends a glove to a private inquirer and expects her to sit on her hands. How tremendously optimistic of them. I set the glove carefully on the desk and put the kettle on. Some thoughts require tea before they can be properly assembled, and this was clearly going to be one of the more elaborate varieties. I had not yet finished my first cup when the telephone rang. The call was from a sergeant at Scotland Yard whom I know slightly and who knows me rather better than he would prefer. He told me, in the clipped tones of a man relaying information he does not fully understand, that Count Alexander Voss, cultural attaché to the Austrian embassy, resident of Eaton Place, and apparently a man of considerable social standing, had been found dead in his private study. Poisoned, the preliminary opinion suggested, at some point between dinner and the 10 o'clock news. He had been discovered by his butler, who had gone to bring a final whiskey and found instead a scene that would require rather more than whiskey to address. And on the floor beside the body, one white evening glove, the match to mine. I looked at the single glove remaining on my desk. I looked at the empty space where its pair had been this morning, now occupied by a dead man on Eaton Place. And I thought about the particular sort of person who sends a message in two halves, one to the living and one to the dead, and what they could possibly want from both of us. Well, let us see what Count Voss has left us to work with.
A dead man, a matching glove, and Miss West already named in the affair before she has laced her boots. Act 2. Eaton Place.
Eaton Place in November has the particular quality of a street that takes its own elegance for granted. The houses are tall and white stuccoed, their facades maintained with the careful effort of people who would never dream of appearing to make an effort. The trees along the pavement have lost their leaves and stand like sentinels in the grey morning, perfectly placed, perfectly bare. Number 47 was indistinguishable from its neighbours, except for the constable stationed at the door, and the faint sense of disturbance that a violent death always leaves in a house, as though the walls themselves are still deciding how to absorb the information. The butler who admitted me had the expression of a man who has spent 30 years in service, has disapproved of everything he has witnessed in that time, and has arrived at a state of settled, professional resignation. He was perhaps 60, upright as a flagpole, and he looked at me the way butlers look at everything, as though I were a minor irregularity that would be smoothed over by the natural course of events. I informed him that I had been asked to assist with inquiries. This was not entirely untrue. He admitted me with the reluctance of a man who has been trained, above all else, never to argue with certainty. The entrance hall of number 47 was exactly what one would expect, and expectation is often the enemy of observation. I paused in the doorway before following the butler, and I looked. A coat stand with one coat missing, a man's coat, the hook still slightly displaced. A silver tray on the hall table bearing 2 calling cards that had not been collected. A faint smell beneath the beeswax and the flowers, something chemical and sweet that did not belong to the house. The study was on the ground floor behind the dining room. The constable at the door stepped aside when I presented myself with sufficient authority, which cost nothing and is usually sufficient. The room told me more than any witness could have. A single brandy glass on the desk. Meta's 1 glass, not 2. Which meant Voss had not been entertaining when he died. He had been waiting. The decanter on the sideboard was barely touched, which meant he had poured the glass and then set it down without drinking. The glass of a man who picks up a drink to have something to do with his hands while he thinks. A cigar in the ashtray, extinguished at the halfway point. Voss had been a man who finished his cigars. The fact of this one, abandoned at its midpoint, spoke of an interruption he had not anticipated. The desk itself was tidy in the manner of a man who is tidy by discipline rather than nature. The edges of paper squared, the pen returned to its stand. But beneath it all, a slight sense of haste, of things put away quickly rather than carefully. And beneath a paperweight shaped like an eagle, bronze, Austrian, the kind of ornament that is also a declaration. A single folded paper. 1 line, written in a careful German hand. Sie wird wissen, was es bedeutet. She will know what it means. I stood in that study for rather a long time, reading the room as carefully as I could, committing every detail to memory. The sweet chemical scent was stronger here, at the armchair beside the fireplace, not at the desk. Voss had been moved after death, or had moved himself in his final moments. The position of the body, as described to me on the telephone, had been near the window. But he had been poisoned near the fire. Someone had arranged the scene, not carelessly, carefully, by someone who knew what investigators look for. That's put me in it, rather.
A carefully arranged scene, a message in German, and a scent that doesn't belong to the house. Miss West goes back to her files. Act 2.5, the Attaché's record.
I keep my files in a system of my own devising, which would be incomprehensible to anyone but me, and is intended to remain so. The primary cabinet holds active and recent cases, sorted by a combination of date and subject that only I can navigate with any speed. The second cabinet, the one with the reinforced lock, holds the other kind. The cases that ended quietly. The matters that were closed before they were finished. The names that appeared twice in separate investigations, with no apparent connection. And then a third time. And then were never mentioned again. The drawer I think of as the diplomatic drawer has, over the years, accumulated a collection that would alarm several members of the House of Lords if they knew it existed. I do not intend to alarm them. I intend merely to be prepared. Count Alexander Voss had a file, though it was thinner than I would have expected for a man who had been in London for 7 years. That thinness was itself informative. People who do interesting things leave traces. People who leave very few traces are either exceptionally dull or exceptionally careful. And Voss's social life, documented in the court circular and the embassy dispatches I had collected over the years, suggested he was emphatically not dull. His official record was impeccably clean, spotlessly, almost aggressively clean. The sort of clean that requires regular maintenance. A quiet word here, a file marked closed there, a memorandum that is circulated to 6 people and then, somehow, reduced to 4 copies, and then 2, and then 1, and then none. 3 years prior, I had come across a reference to Voss in the margin of another matter entirely, a shipping irregularity at Tilbury that turned out to be considerably more irregular than it first appeared. The reference was brief, a Foreign Office memorandum never published but circulated among a very small group, which named Voss as a probable conduit for information passing between London and Vienna, through channels that did not appear in any official diplomatic record. The memorandum had noted, with the particular careful understatement of the Foreign Office at its most anxious, that the information being passed was of a sensitive nature, and that further investigation was recommended. The investigation had lasted 11 days before it was closed. The closure note cited a polite but firm intervention from the Austrian embassy and thanked all parties for their cooperation. Someone had been protecting Count Voss, someone with sufficient influence to end a Foreign Office inquiry in less than a fortnight. And now that same someone, or another someone entirely, had decided that the protection was no longer worth the cost. In my experience, when a patron withdraws their shelter from a man like Voss, it is not because they have discovered his innocence. It is because they have calculated that he is of greater service to them, cold than breathing. The question was, useful to whom? And what had he done, or failed to do, to tip the calculation? And what are you, Count Voss? A man who kept secrets? Or a man who sold them? Both, I suspected. The most dangerous people usually are.
A man protected by powerful friends, until he wasn't. Miss West follows the only physical clue she has. Act 3. The Atelier on Jermyn Street.
Jermyn Street on a November afternoon has a particular quality of purposeful gentility. The shops here do not advertise in the vulgar sense. They simply exist, with the confidence of establishments that have been serving the right sort of people for long enough that the right sort of people know perfectly well where to find them. Shirt makers, boot makers, cheesemongers of the kind that stock 17 varieties of things that are not widely known to be cheese. The atelier of Monsieur Edouard Marchand occupied a narrow frontage between a barber of considerable reputation and a shop selling walking sticks of implausible elegance. The window contained a single pair of gloves on a velvet stand, lit from above, presented with the gravity of a museum exhibit. The message was clear. These are not accessories. These are achievements. Monsieur Marchand was a small, precise man of perhaps 65, with the hands of someone who has spent a lifetime doing very careful work with them and knows it. He received me with the particular wariness of a craftsman who values his client relationships above almost everything, and who can tell at a glance that I am not here to buy gloves. I did not require much persuasion. I required only the right combination of authority and reassurance. The former to make cooperation feel inevitable, the latter to make it feel safe. Monsieur Marchand was, as I had been told, a man of absolute discretion. He was also a man with sufficient intelligence to recognize when discretion had met its reasonable limit. He confirmed that the gloves had been commissioned by a single customer approximately 3 months prior. A woman, tall, he indicated a height several inches above my own. A grey coat of good wool, slightly worn at the cuffs in the manner of a garment that has been kept beyond its ideal season because its owner prefers the familiar to the new. She had paid in cash, not unusual in his experience, and had offered no name, which he had accepted with the practiced incuriosity of a craftsman who has served Mayfair for 3 decades and has learned that the less he asks, the more he is trusted. He remembered her hands. This, he said, was inevitable. He always remembered hands. Long fingers. Good skin, though not pampered, the nails kept short and clean. And on the left palm, a scar, crescent-shaped, old and well-healed, the kind left by something sharp in a previous chapter of a life. She had been specific about the commission. Standard construction, finest kid, white. The stitching along the inner lining was to be done in silk thread, her own thread, which she provided herself, wound carefully on a small card. The thread was to be worked in a pattern she indicated by diagram. He had assumed it was a decorative preference. He understood now that it was not. She'd collected the finished gloves in person, paid the balance, and left without conversation. He had not seen her since. She sent one pair and kept nothing back for herself. She wanted me to find her. The only question is whether she wanted finding before someone else arrived at the same address. I thanked Monsieur Marchand and stepped back out onto Jermyn Street, where the afternoon was dimming toward a grey and indeterminate dusk. London in November has a way of compressing time. The evenings arrive without ceremony, the light simply withdrawing, as though the city has decided it has seen enough for one day. I stood on the pavement and thought about a tall woman in a grey coat who brought her own thread and paid in cash and left no name, and who had then sent one half of her commission to a private inquirer and placed the other half in the keeping of a man she could no longer trust. She was precise, she was careful, and she was frightened enough to have been awake for days making calculations she did not entirely trust. I knew the type. I had, on occasion, been the type. We had best find her before the wrong people do.
A woman in grey with a scar on her palm and a commission that was never merely about gloves. Miss West reaches for the telephone. Act 3.5. The embassy list.
I have a contact in the Foreign Office. I shall call him simply H, as he has asked me to on more than one occasion, and because his full name attached to the things I sometimes ask him would be unfair to us both. H is a man of considerable intelligence and moderate courage, which is a perfectly serviceable combination in normal times, and occasionally insufficient in abnormal ones. He owes me 2 substantial favours. One related to a matter in 1927 that involved a junior clerk, a forged letter of introduction, and a situation that could have been considerably more professionally damaging than it was, due entirely to my timely intervention. The other I am saving. He is always pleased to hear from me, in the manner of a man who is pleased to see his dentist. Resigned, faintly apprehensive, and dimly grateful that the appointment is happening now, rather than later, when things would certainly be worse. Good evening, H. I need the guest list from Friday's embassy reception, the Austrian one, Belgrave Square. And I need to know whether any of the female attendees have been unaccounted for since. Quietly, if you please. Nothing official. No fuss. No forms. He made the noises that H always makes when I ask him for something, a sort of controlled exhale, followed by a brief enumeration of sensitivities, followed by the resigned silence of a man who is already reaching for his files. I waited, which is the correct response. H performs reluctance as a matter of professional habit, but he has never once failed to deliver. He rang back in 53 minutes. I know this because I counted, which is a habit I have developed over years of waiting for things that matter. The reception had been well attended, 61 guests, of whom 19 were women. Of those 19, H had been able to account for all but 3 since Friday evening. One was confirmed on the overnight train to Edinburgh, verified by the railway company. One was at her sister's house in Bath, confirmed by a telephone call that H had apparently made personally, which told me he was more worried than he had sounded. The third was a Viennese national. She appeared on the guest list as companion to the Count, a designation that told me she had been admitted on Voss's authority rather than her own, which meant she had no independent standing at the embassy and no diplomatic protection of any kind. Her name was listed as Hannah Verdal, age 31, nationality Austrian, no further details. She had not been seen since she left the reception at 10:30 on Friday evening. She had vanished as completely as a sixpence down a drain in a rainstorm, which is to say, entirely, and without apparent effort. Thank you, H. You've been splendid. I shan't mention the Bath telephone call to anyone. He rang off with the slightly deflated sound of a man who has been efficiently used and knows it. I sat with Hannah Verdal's name for a while. A Viennese national with no diplomatic standing, attending an embassy function on a dead man's invitation, who had disappeared on the night he was murdered, and had not been seen in 3 days. Either she was in very great danger, or she was very dangerous indeed. In my experience, the two conditions are not mutually exclusive.
A name without a face, and a woman who has made herself invisible with considerable professional skill. Miss West goes looking in all the right places. Act 4, the room above the bookshop.
A woman who wishes to disappear in London has more options than a man, which is one of the few practical advantages the city offers us. We are less conspicuous in motion. We attract less scrutiny in lodging houses. We can alter our appearance with considerably less effort and considerably less expense. But we require the same 3 things: ready cash, a name that asks nothing in return, and a landlord who has built his business on the principle that what he does not know, he cannot be required to repeat. I know several of the third variety. London has always had a quiet trade in such arrangements, conducted without advertisement and sustained by mutual interest. I have on more than one occasion been grateful for their existence. Bloomsbury I covered in 2 hours. The streets I know. The houses that take in the particular kind of lodger who arrives without luggage and pays a week in advance. Nothing. Clerkenwell took 40 minutes. I was beginning to revise my assessment of Elise Brenner upward, a woman who could disappear this thoroughly, in this city, in 3 days, with presumably limited preparation, was not a woman who had come to London unprepared for the possibility of needing to vanish. Soho took less than 20 minutes. The second house I tried, a narrow Georgian terrace above a second-hand bookshop on a street that runs between 2 streets of considerably greater reputation. I found what I was looking for in the expression of a woman who answered the door and looked at me for precisely 1 second too long, before claiming not to know what I was talking about. She opened the door on my second knock, tall as described. The grey coat now considerably crumpled, the cuffs slightly more worn than Monsieur Marchand had observed, as though the past 3 days had aged it. Her hair was dark and pinned with the efficiency of someone who has done it in poor light, and on her left palm, visible as she held the doorframe, the crescent scar. Old, pale, precisely as he had described. Her eyes were extraordinary. Not in color, they were an unremarkable gray, but in quality. They were the eyes of a woman who has been awake for 72 hours running calculations, and has begun to suspect that the mathematics no longer add up in her favor. Watchful, exhausted, and beneath both of those things, something that was not quite hope, but was in the same neighborhood as it. She did not speak. I did not require her to. You sent me the gloves. I've found you. Now, what's the game? And how badly are we placed? She told me everything, not because I compelled her, and not because she had no choice, A woman who had successfully hidden herself from Scotland Yard, the Austrian embassy, and presumably several parties with more direct motivation than either, was not a woman without options. She told me because she had exhausted every alternative and knew it. And because the alternative to telling me was continuing alone, and she had clearly decided that continuing alone was going to get her killed. The story came out in the flat, rapid manner of someone who has rehearsed their confession and is profoundly relieved to be delivering it. For 4 years, Hannah Vidal had been doing quietly extraordinary work. Not the sort of work that appears in newspapers or earns decorations. The invisible sort. The sort conducted in margins and back rooms and on park benches in cities where it is wise to speak quietly and keep your hat brim down. She had been part of a network. Not a government network, not formally, but one that operated with the tacit awareness of several governments who preferred not to be seen to be aware of it. The network's purpose was protection. Specifically, the protection of people who had found themselves dangerously visible in an increasingly dangerous Europe. Academics, journalists, lawyers, artists, scientists. People of conscience who had said the wrong things in the wrong rooms and were now paying for it. The network moved them, sheltered them, gave them papers and identities and new addresses in cities where they were not yet known. It was meticulous, painstaking work, and it required trust at every point in the chain. The kind of trust that cannot be faked and cannot be replaced once broken. The names. 11 of them, embroidered in silk thread along the inner lining of the gloves, 2-point script, barely a millimeter high, readable only under a good magnifying glass at the right angle to the light. Not the names of the people being protected. Those were protected by other means. These were the names of the protectors. The people in positions of quiet influence. Civil servants, a judge, a retired admiral, a woman who sat on 3 charitable boards and knew everyone, and was known to no one as anything other than a tireless philanthropist, who had been enabling the network's work, providing cover, resources, signatures on the right forms at the right moments. If those names became known to the wrong people, 11 lives would be destroyed. The network would collapse. And the people it had been protecting, the academics and journalists and lawyers and scientists, would be left exposed wherever they had been placed, with false identities that could now be traced. Voss had held the gloves in safekeeping. This had seemed 6 months ago a sensible arrangement. Voss was Austrian, embassy-connected, protected by diplomatic considerations that made him effectively untouchable. Elise had trusted him because the network had trusted him, and because he had seemed for 3 years entirely trustworthy. He had been trustworthy until he wasn't. The precise moment of the change she could not identify. These things rarely announce themselves. But over the past 2 months, she had become aware that Voss had been in conversation with a party she could not initially identify, and that the conversations concerned the gloves, and that the word being used in those conversations was not safekeeping, but sale. She had gone to his house on Friday evening to retrieve what was hers. She had arrived at Eaton Place at 9:45, let herself in through a side entrance she had used before. Voss had given her a key months ago when the arrangement was still honorable, and gone directly to his study. He was already dead. She did not know how long he had been dead. The body was cold. She did not stop to examine it further. She was not equipped for that, emotionally or practically, and she understood that every second she remained in the house increased her danger by a factor she could not calculate. She searched for the gloves. One she found immediately, on the floor near the armchair. The second was gone. The study had clearly been searched before she arrived, efficiently and by someone who knew what they were looking for. She took the glove she had found and ran. And the man who killed him and took the second glove. You know his name. She told me without hesitation. The hesitation, I thought, had all been spent in the days before this room. There was nothing left of it. You'll want to make yourself scarce tonight. I know a billet that won't be found. Not by Scotland Yard. Not by anyone with an interest in this matter. Stay there until I send word. The glove stays with me. I have a use for it yet. She looked at me for a moment with those exhausted, calculating eyes. Then she nodded. She did not argue. She did not ask for reassurance. She accepted the instruction with the directness of a woman who has learned the hard way that trust must sometimes be extended on incomplete evidence, or not at all. Sensible woman. The best kind.
11 names. 11 lives. A network unraveling. And the man who holds the second glove is not a man who waits. Act 5. The second glove.
I worked by lamplight, which is slower but more honest than electric light. It casts fewer shadows in the wrong places and creates fewer illusions of certainty. The glove lay on a square of black velvet on my desk, and I went over it with a magnifying glass, in the systematic manner I had developed over years of examining things that rewarded patience. Section by section, seam by seam, beginning at the fingertips and working back toward the wrist. The outer surface told me only what I already knew. Finest kid, immaculate work. White and clean despite 3 days in a frightened woman's pocket. Monsieur Marchand's craftsmanship held even under the magnifying glass. The man was an artist. The inner lining was where the other art lived. At 3/4 power, I could see the variation in the stitching along the inner seam, the slight thickening of the thread, the microscopic change in texture. At full power, under the lamp, the letters resolved. They were extraordinary. 2-point script, perfectly formed, each letter perhaps a millimeter high. Worked in a silk thread of almost identical color to the lining, distinguishable only by texture, not by eye. Whoever had done this, Hannah Vedrell, I presumed, had the hands of a watchmaker and the patience of someone who understood precisely what depended on the work being invisible. 11 names, 6 British, 3 French. 2 that I could not immediately place by nationality, but whose designations, the careful use of titles and postnominals, told me they were people of position. I wrote them out in my own hand on a fresh sheet of paper, then read them 3 times, then locked the paper in my secondary cabinet, and stood at the window for a while. These were not informants. They were not spies in any melodramatic sense of the word. They were people who had used their positions, their respectability, their access, their signatures on legitimate documents, to do something risky and decent for people who had no other recourse. A retired admiral who had, apparently, provided papers. A judge who had, apparently, been willing to look in a particular direction on a particular occasion. A woman whose name appeared on the boards of 4 charitable organizations and who had been moving people and money with the cover of philanthropy. They were, every one of them, people who could be destroyed, professionally, legally, personally, if their involvement became known. And there was a man in this city who currently held a glove with their names on it and intended to use them. Not while I have anything to say about it. I made 2 telephone calls, one to arrange Hannah Vedrell's temporary billet, which was accomplished within the hour, one to the one person I trusted with the shape of what was coming, without the details, so that we could agree on timing. Then I sat with the glove and thought about Gerald Purvis, and how to set a trap for a man who was almost certainly, at this moment, setting one for me.
The names are read. The trap is being laid on both sides simultaneously. Miss West goes to the one place she is certainly not welcome. Act 6. Mr. Gerald Purvis.
There is a particular variety of dangerous man that London produces, with a quiet, almost administrative regularity. He is not violent by instinct. Violence is messy, draws attention, leaves traces that require management. He is violent by arithmetic, when the calculation demands it. And the calculation is always made coolly, at a remove, in a room where nobody can hear the conclusion being reached. He is the kind of man who does not appear in newspapers. He is the kind of man who appears in the margins of other people's troubles. A name mentioned once and not explained, a reference that goes nowhere, a connection that other investigators note and then, somehow, do not pursue. Gerald Purvis had come to me 3 times in 2 days, each time from a different direction. A name half recalled in conversation at the embassy, a reference in a Foreign Office document that H had not noticed he was including when he sent over the guest list. A whisper from a source I maintain in Limehouse, who deals, as I do, in the currency of information, and who knows when something is circulating that is not meant to circulate. No title. A private broker. An office in the city that appeared from the street to be an entirely unremarkable import concern dealing in Far Eastern textiles, the sort of business that no one investigates because no one finds it sufficiently interesting to begin. I did not go to his office. His office was his territory, and territory matters more than people acknowledge when one is about to have a significant conversation with a man who would prefer not to have it. I went to his club. The club was on Pall Mall, which narrowed it to perhaps 8 possibilities, and H had been able to confirm which one within a single telephone call. Women were not admitted as members. Women are not admitted as members of a great many institutions in this city, which has the paradoxical effect of making those institutions significantly easier for a woman to move through undetected, since the men inside them have not developed the habit of looking for us. I entered as a telegraph messenger with an urgent delivery. This requires a messenger's coat, which I keep in my office cupboard, a sealed envelope addressed in official-looking script, and the absolute confidence of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Confidence is 9/10 of any disguise. The coat accounts for the remainder. I was inside and past the porter's lodge in under 90 seconds. Purvis was in the reading room, which is where men like him always are. They like rooms with newspapers, because newspapers are a socially acceptable reason to be sitting very still in a public place, while you think about things you would prefer others did not know you were thinking about. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired, well-dressed in the manner of a man for whom clothes are armor rather than pleasure. Everything chosen for the impression it creates, nothing chosen for comfort. He sat very straight, which people do when they are always performing, even when they believe no one is watching. He looked up when I sat down across from him, and his expression told me 2 things immediately. That he knew precisely who I was, and that he had been expecting me to come, if not quite this soon. He spoke first, which was his first miscalculation. Men who speak first in these situations are men who are more anxious than they appear. He was smooth about it, urbanely so. He expressed no alarm, no surprise, no displeasure, merely the polished courtesy of a man who considers himself to be in complete command of circumstances, and who intends that impression to do most of his work for him. He made his proposal without embarrassment, and with what he clearly felt was a generous offer. The glove, he suggested, in exchange for a sum he named as though conferring a favor. He was, he assured me, entirely a man of his word. The matter could be resolved tonight, quietly, to everyone's satisfaction. How perfectly topping of you. I'm afraid I must decline. The glove contains names that are not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. Not at any price you are in a position to name. And the conversation you're hoping this is, it rather isn't. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not panic. Men like Purvis do not panic in the conventional sense. But a rapid recalculation, the swift revision of a plan whose first assumption had just been disproved. He reached beneath the table. I had anticipated as much. It was exactly what I would have done in his position, and I had been in his position's approximate vicinity often enough to know the instinct. I had moved the ashtray before he reached it, and I placed my hand on his wrist with exactly the degree of pressure required to communicate that I had performed this maneuver on considerably more physically formidable men than him, and that the outcome had been consistent. He went very still. Good. Still men are easier to reason with than moving ones. There is a detective inspector outside this building right now, with a warrant that has been signed, sealed, and is merely awaiting the occasion of your exit. He is a patient man, considerably more patient than I am, which is saying something. I would sit quite still if I were you, and take a moment to consider which version of this evening you would prefer to be remembered by. I held his gaze for a count of 5. Then I stood, smoothed my coat, and walked to the door of the reading room, which I opened to admit Detective Inspector Alistair Flynn, who entered with a particular quality of unhurried authority that I have always found compelling and have never once mentioned.
Gerald Purvis discovers that the trap was not the one he had been laying. The machinery of justice, however creaking, turns. Act 7. After.
Purvis was collected with the minimum of theatre, which is the way these things are best accomplished. Clubs like that one depend above almost everything on the maintenance of atmosphere, the sense that within their walls the world's unpleasantness remains gratifyingly at bay. A man being arrested in the reading room threatened that atmosphere, and the club secretary, a thin, worried man who had appeared from somewhere during the proceedings, made it abundantly clear that a quiet exit through the side entrance would be very much appreciated. Flynn, to his credit, obliged. He has always understood the importance of choosing which battles to have in which rooms. The second glove was recovered from Purvis's Mayfair flat the following morning, in a document case in the bottom drawer of his study desk, beneath a false panel that was reasonably well concealed and would have taken someone looking for it perhaps 20 minutes to locate. Flynn's team found it in 8, which I considered creditable. The glove was intact. The lining had been examined, I could tell from the slight disturbance to the stitching at one end, but not decoded. Purvis had not yet found the right glass, or the right angle, or the right expert to whom he had been willing to show it. A near thing. Hannah Vedrell was aboard a boat train to Calais by 7 the following morning. Before she left, the second glove was brought to her, and she spent the night unpicking the lining with the same meticulous patience that had stitched it in the first place, committing the 11 names to a new and safer form of keeping, and reducing the silk thread to nothing recoverable. She left no forwarding address. She left no note of thanks, no acknowledgement of debt, no word of farewell. I respected her enormously for all three. A woman in her position cannot afford sentiment, and the absence of it was itself a kind of professional courtesy. She was treating me as someone who understood the work, not someone who needed to be thanked for it. Scotland Yard logged the matter of Count Voss's death as a diplomatic incident, pending further correspondence with Vienna. The Foreign Office filed the broader affair under a classification number that means, translated into plain English, we are fully aware of what has occurred. We are saying absolutely nothing about it publicly, and we would be most sincerely grateful if all parties involved would extend us the same courtesy. Indefinitely. I was not named in any document. I did not expect to be. I filed the case myself, under G, for gloves. And for the 11 people who will never know how close it was.
The case closed without fanfare, which is, perhaps, the only appropriate ending for a case that was never supposed to exist. But the evening is not quite finished.
I was on my second glass of something I had poured without examining the label, when Flynn knocked. Not the knock of a man announcing himself. He has never knocked like that. Not once in the time I have known him. His knock is quieter than that, and more deliberate, and contains within it the implicit understanding that I may choose not to answer, and that he will not be offended if I don't. It is, I have sometimes thought, the knock of a man who has learned the difference between a door that is closed and a door that is shut. I answered it. He was still in his coat. He had come directly from the business of the evening. There was a faint dampness to his shoulders from rain that had since stopped, and the look about him of a man who has finished a thing properly and is not quite ready to be finished with it yet. He produced a bottle from his coat pocket and set it on the desk without comment. Not the label I had been drinking. Better.
They're already calling it a diplomatic incident down at the Yard. Apparently it's all terrifically hush-hush. 3 separate superintendents have each separately and independently decided that they don't know anything about it.
They call everything a diplomatic incident when they can't agree on who to blame. It saves paperwork and spares everyone the embarrassment of admitting they were looking the other way.
The 11 names. All safe, you said.
For now. Which is all any name ever is. Safe for now. Which is the best anyone can honestly promise.
Purvis will have counsel by morning. Good counsel.
He'll have the best that money can procure, which in his case is considerable. But H has what he needs, and the Foreign Office has found its nerve. They generally do when the alternative is worse. He won't walk.
No, he won't walk.
We sat with that for a moment. The clock on the mantel counted 11 seconds. I know because I counted with it, which is another habit I have, and have never examined.
You went into that club alone.
I go everywhere alone, Alistair. It's rather the nature of the enterprise. You know that perfectly well.
I know what you say the nature of the enterprise is. I'm not entirely convinced the enterprise has been consulted.
This was the kind of thing Flynn says occasionally, sliding something sideways into a conversation in the manner of a man posting a letter, and then walking away before you can read the address. I have learned not to respond to these immediately, partly because I am not always certain what the correct response would be, and partly because I am not certain. I wish to be certain. I looked at the fire instead. The fire is a reliable object. It burns. It requires tending. It does not ask difficult questions or post letters and walk away. I am careful, you know. I am considerably more careful than I appear.
That is the most Maud West thing you have ever said to me. And I want you to know that I find it both entirely convincing and completely beside the point.
I looked at him then. He was watching the fire rather than me, which was either consideration or self-protection, and I found I could not immediately determine which. He has a face that rewards attention. I have observed this professionally, and set it aside professionally, and not always succeeded in keeping it set aside. There was something in his expression tonight that was different from the ordinary end-of-a-case tiredness. Not heavier, quieter. The look of a man who has arrived at the edge of something he has been approaching gradually, and has not quite decided whether to step forward or back. He reached forward and poured 2 glasses from the bottle he'd brought. Set one at my side without comment. He does this, these small, practical gestures that seek no acknowledgement and are not offered for the sake of it. I have noticed this about him for some time and have discussed it with no one, including myself, in any terms I have been willing to formalize.
It needn't be, you know. The solitude.
Alistair.
I'm not asking you to change the Enterprise. I wouldn't. I'm simply noting, for the record.
I looked at the fire. Then I looked at him. Then I looked at the fire again, which is what one does when one is trying to think clearly about something that resists clarity. The room was very quiet. Outside, London continued its evening. A motor car somewhere, a distant door, the ordinary sounds of a city that does not pause for the conversations happening inside its rooms. The clock counted. The fire settled. Flynn sat in the chair opposite as though he had a great deal of patience, and intended to use it at his own rate. Noted. He exhaled, very slightly, very controlled, in the manner of a man who has been holding something carefully for some time, and has been given permission for the moment to hold it slightly less carefully. He did not press further. He would not. That is not how Flynn operates. He states a thing once with precision, and then he waits. He has extraordinary patience. It is one of the things I find, on occasion, most difficult about him. We sat by the fire and talked about other things. About a case he had in Stepney that was proving irritating. About a new development at the yard that was proving worse. About a small restaurant in Soho that he had visited and considered worth mentioning. Easy conversation, the kind that travels, without requiring a destination. At some point, well after 10 o'clock, he stood, picked up his coat from the arm of the chair, looked at me with an expression I have catalogued and not yet fully interpreted, which I am aware is the sort of admission one does not make freely.
Good night, Maud.
Good night, Inspector. I listened to his footsteps until the street door closed, and the sound of him folded into the ordinary sounds of the city, and disappeared. The fire had burned lower. I reached forward and put another piece of coal on it, a small, practical act, the kind that does not require thought, and provides a moment in which thought can arrange itself without being observed. I picked up his glass from the side table where he had left it, and turned it slowly in my hands. He had not finished it. Perhaps a third remained, barely. The glass was still faintly warm. I held it for rather longer, than was strictly necessary. Then I set it down, very carefully, exactly where he had left it, and went to the window to look at the street below. London, at this hour, has a particular quality of being both entirely itself and entirely mysterious. The same streets you walked this morning, carrying different purposes through the same dark. The same city, never quite the same. I have watched it from this window for years, and it has never once become fully predictable, which is the primary reason I remain. Noted.
And so the case of the Diplomat's gloves comes to its quiet close, though Miss West's fireplace holds more than one kind of warmth this evening. But first, a final word from our inquirer herself.
London runs on secrets. Most of them are small, small enough to be slipped into a coat pocket, whispered between courses at dinner, dissolved in the ordinary passage of a morning. They are the lubricant of this city's great social machinery, and the machinery runs, whether you observe it or not. But some secrets carry the weight of lives, the kind that cannot be pocketed or whispered, that sit with the full gravity of what they contain and require, at every stage of their keeping, not just discretion, but something closer to courage. The willingness to hold something that matters for people you will never meet, in circumstances where the holding itself is the most dangerous part of the work. Tonight I held 11 such names. I shall not hold them much longer. They are in safer keeping now. But the weight of them, for one night, was mine to carry, which I do not resent. It is, after all, the work. As for the other matter, the glass on the side table, the footsteps on the stairs, the word that was noted and left to settle, I find I am not, at present, in a position to file that away satisfactorily. It remains on my desk, in a manner of speaking, requiring attention I have not yet quite summoned. I shall leave it there for now. Some things are best considered slowly, in the company of a dying fire, and a city that does not rush you. Until the next inquiry, I remain Maud West, private inquirer, reluctant optimist, keeper of other people's careful stitching, occasional uninvited guest at gentlemen's clubs, and a woman who holds glasses longer than is strictly necessary and calls it, for now, sufficient.
You have been listening to the case files of Maud West. Join us next time when London's secrets find, as they always must, into another exciting case.